You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week's episode is a book review, and the book is A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy by William B. Irvine. What you're going to hear is a discussion between me and my wife, Hannah. We recorded this for another podcast that we do together called the Psychology Book Club. You can find that at psychologybookclub.org. But I also want to share it with you as an episode of The Voluntary Life because this book is really relevant for so many of the topics that we talk about on The Voluntary Life. And I think it's a great book too. I hope you enjoy it. So without further delay, here's our discussion of A Guide to the Good Life by William B. Irvine.
Hi everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Psychology Book Club. In this episode, we are discussing the book A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy by William B. Irvine. So Jake is joining me today, as usual. Hi Jake.
Hello.
I'm really looking forward to discussing this book today. I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really interesting take on Stoic philosophy. I didn't know a lot about Stoic philosophy before I started reading this.
Yeah, let's just say that we are also joined by our daughter Freya, who you can hear grumbling in the background.
She's sleeping right now, but she's stirring a little bit, so we might get the odd interjection from her on this episode. So I thought it would be useful to start by giving an overview of, well, what is Stoic philosophy? What are the key principles? Why should one practice Stoicism? Because this wasn't actually something that I was very clear on before I started reading this book. I feel like Stoicism, particularly in the last couple of years, has seen quite a resurgence in popularity. A couple of people have published quite prominent books about it. It seems to be something that is becoming more popular now than it has been for, as William Irvine talks about in this book, a good long while. So I sort of knew bits and pieces about it, but it was really helpful to get a clear overview of, okay, this is what Stoicism is, this is how you practice it, this is why it's useful, and this is the point of Stoicism as well. So maybe you'd like to give a general overview of what you took to be the key principles and purpose behind Stoicism.
Yeah, so this is a book in which the author William Irvine, who I think is a university professor, is basically providing a modern interpretation and summary of what Stoicism is. And Stoicism is one of the philosophies to come out of the period of ancient Greece, and then especially into ancient Rome. And it came after people like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And it was a much more personal philosophy, whereas Plato had written about things like, the republic and the state and how we should organize the whole of society. Stoicism was a much more personal philosophy about how you live your own life and what is the best way to live a good life, as is the title of this book. And that's one of the things that I really like about Stoicism, is it's not a political philosophy. It's not about how other people should live, but it's about how you live your own life.
And just to jump in and say, my take on what he means by a good life is that it's a good life in terms of your own experience of it, but it's also a good life in terms of how you interact with your fellow humans as well, and how you are present in the world and how you live, essentially.
Exactly. And there's a great quote in this book, I think probably one of my favorite quotes in the book, where the author, William Irvine, says, having a philosophy of life, whether it be Stoicism or some other philosophy, can dramatically simplify everyday living. If you have a philosophy of life, decision-making is relatively straightforward. When choosing between the options life offers, you simply choose the one most likely to help you attain the goals set forth by your philosophy of life. In the absence of a philosophy of life, though, even relatively simple choices can degenerate into meaning of life crises. It is, after all, hard to know what to choose when you aren't really sure what you want. The most important reason for adopting a philosophy of life, though, is that if we lack one, there is a danger that we will mislive, that we will spend our life pursuing goals that aren't worth attaining, or we will pursue worthwhile goals in a foolish manner and will therefore fail to attain them. I thought that was great because that really summarizes for me the whole idea of this more personal approach to philosophy, which is about how should you live your own life to have the most fulfilling and meaningful life possible.
I agree. I thought it was a really poignant description and a really moving description of why it's so important to have a philosophy of life. And perhaps this is jumping ahead a little bit, but later on in the book, he says it doesn't have to be Stoicism. Stoicism works for him. It's going to work for other people, but it's not the philosophy for everybody. And as far as he's concerned, if this book encourages people to do anything, he'd much rather that it encourages people to develop a philosophy for life, whatever that is, rather than to be devout Stoicism adherents, right? He says it doesn't matter what philosophy it is so much. Obviously, there's better and worse philosophies, and he goes through a couple of those. But yeah, he makes that point that having a philosophy is more important in some ways than what philosophy exactly it is.
Yeah. And to come back to your question about, okay, so what is Stoicism then? Stoicism isn't exactly a complete, coherent body of ideas that sits apart that you can say, okay, that's Stoicism. What I found Stoicism to be is frankly basically just rational thinking. I mean, he says in the book that the key ideas of the Stoics were that the first purpose in life is to think rationally, combined with a few ideas about how you can apply reason and thinking rationally to your own life to live a good life. And we can go through what those ideas are. And they're things like focusing on the things that you control and not the things that you don't control, and being critical of your emotions and looking at where they come from and that kind of thing. But I think the point I want to make is that I personally didn't find Stoicism to be this separate, coherent, entire philosophy that sits out on its own. It's more like a collection of ideas that are all sort of about being rational and applying that to your own life. Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. And that's why I thought it would be a great choice for this book club, because this isn't the philosophy book club, it's a psychology book club. And more so than any other philosophies I've read about, I felt like Stoicism, or at least the way that William Irvine describes Stoicism and the way that he presents it, it provides really useful tools that we can actually use in our daily lives to cultivate more tranquility, which is ultimately what he says. It's the point of Stoicism, is to the ultimate goal is that tranquility is worth pursuing above all other things, you know, above fortune, above fame, above material goods, above all these things that for a lot of us are the default things that we do pursue, whether because that's what society says we should pursue or because we're trying to meet certain unmet needs within us and so on. But he says it's tranquility above everything else. Which is not a bad goal, I think personally. I think that's a very worthy goal to have, to pursue tranquility. So yeah, I thought it would be interesting to talk not only about the principles behind the philosophy, but also some of the psychological techniques that he talks about within the book, because I certainly found these really useful. And one of the interesting things about this book for me was that I kind of do some of these things anyway. And it was nice to sort of be able to put a description to what these things are. And in some cases, for example, in the case of negative visualization, which we can talk about a bit later, to realize that although I had previously viewed that as something wrong that I was doing, that actually there can be a useful purpose to it as well.
Yes, absolutely. Do you want to explain a bit more about what it is and what you mean?
Yeah, so perhaps it would be useful to run through the psychological techniques that he talks about in the book and just give a brief overview of them, and then go back and examine the ones that we want to talk about a little bit more in detail. So he presents 5 psychological techniques that are, I guess, the foundational practices of Stoicism in this book. And the first one is negative visualization, which is essentially, I guess, imagining disaster scenarios, all the things that we fear to come to pass, losing people that we really care about, having our home taken away, having all of our security, our financial security, our relationships, our job, having everything that we care about taken away, and imagining what life would be like if that were the case. So in some psychological circles, this might be called catastrophizing or imagining the worst and so on. But the point that Stoics make is that actually it can make you appreciate what you have in the present a lot more than if you just take everything that you have for granted, because all of the stuff that we have right now could be taken away. It hopefully won't be, but it's always possible. And so the point with negative visualization is to think about that eventuality as a thought experiment, not because we want to get really caught up in doom and gloom and in fear and so on, but because we want to feel more gratitude for the things that we have in the present moment. And that's been a really interesting one for me to think about, because as we've been talking about quite a lot since we had our daughter a couple of months ago, I certainly have been feeling quite a lot of anxiety about, oh my gosh, what if something happens to her? What if, and whenever we've kind of gone out or been in different situations, or especially been in new situations, I've had all these, quite outrageous or quite outlandish disaster scenarios running through my head about potential things that could happen to her or to happen to us and so on. And what I take from that, having read this book, is to kind of, when that happens, to take a deep breath and just remember, okay, well, that's why it's really important to embrace this present moment and to really appreciate the time that we are spending with her now, even more.
Absolutely. I get that. I think the thing about negative visualization is that I see it as very different from catastrophizing, because I think the idea behind catastrophizing is to go through life afraid of bad things that you think are going to happen or that you're afraid are going to happen. Whereas the idea of negative visualization, I think the idea is to say, when you're stressed out about stuff that didn't work out as you had hoped, don't forget to enjoy and be grateful for the things that you do have in life, because you could lose them. So, for example, I made a mistake in investing recently and it cost me some money, and I can focus on that and I can think about this mistake that I made and really depress myself about it. Or I can also think that, well, I could have lost all my money in other circumstances. Other things could have happened which could have left me broke, and I'm not. So rather than focus on the stuff that gets me down, I think the idea is to take comfort and enjoy and feel good about all the good things, and don't forget the good things in life. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And equally, I've had some health issues recently, and it's been really useful to be able to think, okay, well, this sucks. But I mean, everybody says you should, when people are struggling with something, you should never use the words at least. But that's actually been quite a comfort to me, is to say, well, at least it's totally fixable. There's so much that I can do about it, and I am doing about it. And it frankly could be way, way worse than it is. And it's actually been quite a comfort for me to remember that, and to do this negative visualization and imagine all these sort of what if scenarios. Well, what if it was this way, and what if it was that way, which is so much worse than my current reality.
Yeah.
So that's negative visualization. The second psychological technique that he talks about is what he calls the trichotomy of control. And I think this is a play on words. I'm not sure there is such a word as trichotomy, but he talks about the dichotomy of control, where we tend to view life as there are things that we can control and there are things that we can't control. And everything fits into those two categories. And he says that that's actually not true. And what is more accurate is to think of it as a trichotomy of control. So there are things that we can control, there are things that we can't control, and there are things that we can control some elements of. So I think one of the analogies he uses is a tennis match, right? We cannot control the outcome of the tennis match. It's not that we can't control it entirely, nor can we control it fully, but there are some elements that we can control and there are some elements that we can't control. So for example, we can't control how our opponent plays. We can be playing at our best. They might just be more skilled, better at tennis than us, in which case they're going to win the match. The only thing that we can control in that situation is how we show up and how we play, and how much practice we put in and preparation we put in advance of the match and so on. So that's the trichotomy of control. Was there anything that you wanted to say about that? Yeah,
I think this idea for me is probably the most useful aspect of Stoicism. And it's basically a kind of focus that you can do on a simple, rational truth about life. And it is that there is no point in wasting your effort on things that are out of your control. And so many people spend so much time wasting stuff that's out on things that are out of their control. Mm. And the Stoics wanted to focus only on the things that they control, and for things that are more complicated, those aspects that they do have some control over. Like you said, you do control how well you play in a game of tennis and what you can do in a game of tennis. You don't control the outcome of the game. So there's no point in making that your goal, because it's not your problem, basically, things that are outside your control. And I think this is probably the most useful and important insight that I found in Stoicism. And I really agree with it 100%. I think life goes off the rails when you try and put your energy into things that are not in your control. And examples of that would be throwing yourself into politics and things that are totally outside your control. What you can do is put your efforts into living a good life in your own relationships, in your own life, and in the way that you live.
Absolutely. One of the analogies that he shared that I appreciated in particular because it directly applies to my life is the analogy of writing. And he says that if someone is a writer, and I think this applies to most creative endeavors in life, if not all, and other things besides that, which is that if you are a writer, you have... I think she's dreaming. Do you have something you'd like to share? If you are a writer, you have two challenges facing you. The first is to become really good at your craft, and the second is to deal with rejection. And he said it's the latter that actually stops most people writing. It's not that they're not good writers. It's just that the fear of rejection is so big in a lot of people that they never really do what it takes to give themselves the chance to become a writer or to have, you know, whatever their version of success looks like. And I thought that was a really interesting idea because I know certainly that's a challenge that I have faced. And I've never really thought about it quite in this way, but obviously because I've done coaching as a client and I am a coach myself, it's something that I've spent a lot of time talking about as a client and as a coach myself is, well, what exactly do we have control over in life? And just how important it is to... Oh, hi, joining us. And just how important it is to be able to differentiate in any given situation. Okay, these are the things that I have control over, these are the things that I don't. And to focus our energy on what really matters. Because ultimately, you know, when it comes to things like what other people think of our work or what even other people think of us, which is something that he gets into later in the book, which I thought was a really interesting section as well, is how to deal with annoying people and how to deal with people who insult you. We can't control what other people think of us and we can't control how other people respond to us. The only thing that we can control is our own sense of responsibility for ourselves and how we show up in the world.
Absolutely. And in fact, for this whole business of control and the focus on like things that are in your control and things versus things that are not in your control, one of the things that he talks about and that the Stoics talked about is your reputation. That is a classic example of something that's not in your control and that there's no point in worrying about it because you do not control your reputation with other people. You can live a good life yourself, but what other people think of you is outside your control. He talks about an example of Seneca, who was a Roman Stoic, and Seneca used to apparently deliberately dress unfashionably in order to remind himself not to care what other people thought about stuff like that and what other people thought of him. I just want to read a quick quote about this. This is not from this book, but it's another quote, which I think is really about this idea of focusing on what you control and not what other people think of you. This quote is from Martha Graham. So here's the quote. There is a vitality, a life force, an energy, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there is only one of you in all of time, this expression is unique. And if you block it, it will never exist through any other medium and it will be lost. The world will not have it. It is not your business to determine how good it is, nor how valuable, nor how it compares with other expressions. It is your business to keep it yours clearly and directly and to keep the channel open. And I think that's a very nice example of a quote that sort of explains, stop worrying about what other people think and get on with what is your business, which is doing the best that you can in your own life.
And I think for a lot of us, I know certainly for me, that is one of the number one things that disturbs my sense of tranquility is worrying about what other people think.
Yeah.
So just to come back to the last three techniques and run through them quickly. The third one is fatalism, so letting go of the past and present. And this is the idea that we can't change the past. And you also can't change the present really either. You can change the future, or you have some control over the future. But when it comes to the present, we can either spend the present wishing it were different, or we can just embrace it as it is. So that's fatalism.
Can I just say something about that? Because this is the one idea that I do understand this idea, and I appreciate that it's good to not wallow in self-pity about how things could have been different. And I really appreciate that. But I also, this is one that I have some difficulty with because I don't know where the Stoics draw the line between fatalism, which means just accept your lot and don't try and change your life, and fatalism, which is don't dwell on how things could have been different, but go for it and make the best of your life. Do you know what I mean?
This is a really interesting question, and I wondered this as well. My sense was that he addresses this later in the book when he talks about how you can practice Stoicism and you can still be, for example, ambitious. It's just that the things that Stoics are ambitious about are probably quite different to things that people who don't necessarily practice Stoicism are ambitious about. For example, he says that Stoics can amass wealth and they can, the whole fame and fortune thing, Stoics can amass wealth. They can become famous. That's not, quote, anti-Stoicism. It's not contrary to the principles that they talk about, but those things are more of a byproduct of pursuing tranquility. And so when I think about that in the context of the fatalism issue, my sense is that when they advocate practicing fatalism, it's not in pursuit of fatalism itself. It's to the extent that it introduces tranquility into your life. So, for example, dwelling on the past and living in the past and, dwelling on, for example, things that are not ideal about our lives today, that does not help our sense of tranquility. I don't think what he's saying, though, is that we should practice fatalism at all costs. So, for example, that fatalism is the goal. It's that this is a tool that we can use in our pursuit of tranquility to a certain degree. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah. I guess thinking it through, the idea would be fatalistic about the things that you can't change.
Exactly.
And not about the things that are in your power to change.
Absolutely.
So basically, if you find yourself in a situation where there's certain aspects that you can't change, then there's no point in dwelling on it, but you should just focus all of your efforts on the things that you can actually impact.
Yeah, exactly.
And the key, of course, is to get it right and know the difference between the things that it is your business to try and change, that are rightfully in your control, and things that aren't in your control.
Absolutely. And this is where the fifth, I'll get back to the fourth and the fourth psychological technique in a second, but the fifth psychological technique is meditation. He calls it meditation. From the way he describes it, it sounds less like meditation in the sense that most of us might know it, and more like a period of self-reflection, regular opportunities to reflect on how our practice of Stoicism is going and cultivate self-awareness around that. And I think that's where that practice of knowing the difference between, for example, in the week previous to this, how well did I, looking back now with the gift of hindsight, how well did I differentiate between things that I can control and things that I can't control? And did I put my energy into the right things?
Yeah, I guess the point here was simply to live a conscious life and think about your life and be aware of it. It's like the old idea that goes back to Socrates of the unexamined life is not worth living.
Mm-hmm, exactly. So just to come back to the fourth psychological technique quickly, that is self-denial. And this was an interesting one. So he talks about practicing self-denial. And one of the examples he gives is, if just as with negative visualization, you might visualize you losing all of your money, for example, and that helps put your current issues in perspective. And it also helps you appreciate what you have rather than dwelling on what you don't have or what you'd like more of. So he says to take this a step further, or I think actually one of the Stoic philosophers suggested taking this a step further and actually exercising what he called practice poverty. So living, for example, for a temporary period as though you don't have any money, and just living to see what that's like. And I think the idea behind this is that it gives you greater resilience and a greater ability to deal with life's challenges, because none of us have a crystal ball, so we don't know what's going to happen. And he says if we practice getting used to minor discomforts in our daily life, then we're going to have greater confidence about our ability to deal with major discomforts if and when they happen.
Yeah, I thought that was a really important part of this book, that whole idea. And the author, William Irvine, actually talks about this quite well in talking about how and why he adopted Stoicism. Because he says, in the early part of the book, he says, I saw no need to ponder a philosophy of life. I instead felt comfortable with what is, for almost everyone, the default philosophy of life, to spend one day seeking an interesting mix of affluence, social status, and pleasure. My philosophy of life, in other words, was what might charitably be called an enlightened form of hedonism. And then he goes on to say that, the idea of Stoicism is not that you don't enjoy things like affluence or wealth or whatever, but you don't cling too tightly to those things.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is this idea that you're talking about of voluntarily experiencing discomfort so that you remember the things that you value in life and so that you don't become complacent, essentially.
Or that you don't spend all of your time worrying about losing it as well. Because my sense is that, especially around money, this is something that's really, really common, even among people who are objectively very rich. In their minds, they feel very poor because they're constantly worrying about losing what they have.
Right, absolutely. And that makes a ton of sense to me, that to take that approach of staying in touch with your core values is really what he's talking about, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that comes back to the key principles behind this philosophy, which is that tranquility is worth pursuing above all else.
I thought one thing that was very interesting about that is that this book really reminds me of a book that we talked about recently, of overcoming negative emotions. And in fact, in William Irvine's book, The Good Life, he does talk about negative emotions, and the Stoicism is very much focused on, addressing your emotions. And I think it's very similar to the approach outlined in that book, Guilt, Shame and Anxiety, that we did recently, which is that just because evolution has kind of given us these feelings, it doesn't mean that they're helpful. And in the Stoicism book, the Stoics had a very similar kind of approach.
Absolutely. I mean, you could say that you can't control whether or not you feel guilt, shame and anxiety, or the other. I think he talks about grief as being a negative emotion in this book as well, and fear. But we can control how we respond to them and what we do with those feelings.
Right, exactly. There's a bit at the end that I thought I would just mention, which I thought was quite helpful, which was William Irvine kind of bringing Stoicism up to date, because the Stoics did have lots of funny ideas about God and about fate and various things. And William Irvine in this book essentially presents a slightly different take, kind of a modern take on Stoicism based on evolution. He just jettisons all of that out-of-date cosmology and lack of scientific understanding that the Stoics had, and he basically comes up with a more modern interpretation. And in short, his summary is this. He kind of says, look, evolution has given us both emotions and reason. We have these things, including we have the ability to reason, simply because it made us more effective reproducers in the past. It made us more effective at passing on our genes. But the idea of Stoicism is to say, just because evolution has given you reason simply to make you a more effective reproducer, you can actually hack reason and use it for other purposes. You can use it to live a more tranquil and fulfilled life. You don't have to just follow the sort of pleasure principle that evolution has given us. You can actually live a more fulfilled life by using your mind to imagine the things that are most valuable to you and to direct your life on a more rational basis.
I think that part of the book is really valuable, because I could imagine reading this that one of the key criticisms of Stoicism would be that, well, it applies to a different time. The world is very, very different now. And they believe all this crazy stuff about Zeus and, all this sort of stuff that is just not at all relevant to...
They had all these kooky ideas.
Exactly. And that could be a way of discrediting it. So I thought I really appreciated the fact that he put those concepts in the context of what we know about the world today.
Yeah, and I think it's always really valuable to take apart ideas of thinkers and don't treat them as a coherent whole, because everyone has their own blind spots, and people in the past didn't know things that we know now. Mm-hmm. And consequently, there are valuable ideas in an ancient philosophy like Stoicism, but there were also some kooky ideas in there too, and you don't have to take both of them.
And the funny thing is that even though a lot of Stoic philosophy is based on ideas from thousands of years ago, so much of the advice that he talks about in this book is still very, very relevant to things that most of us struggle with today. I think it's the third part of the book is Stoic Advice, and it's all about stuff like dealing with insults. And these are all things that the vast majority of people still struggle with. They were struggling with it in Roman times, and they're still struggling with it today. And actually, the advice for dealing with it is really, really good advice. I thought, anyway.
Absolutely. Were there any gems that you wanted to point out?
Yeah, something I found really interesting was the putting up with put down section, because especially right now in our society, in Western culture, there's a lot of talk about trigger warnings, and there's a lot of...
offended people? Yeah,
that's a diplomatic way of putting it. There's a lot of people who are getting very offended about a multitude of things, right? And I understand where the desire to protect those people comes from, and to protect people who are marginalized or disadvantaged. But he actually makes the point that that's not in their best interest. When we try and protect people from things that might offend them or things that might hurt them, we actually disadvantage them even further, because we essentially infantilize them. And he makes an equal point that it's in the best interests of people who are offended to teach them insult self-defense rather than to punish people who offend them or to try and sort of wrap them up in cotton wool or so on. Because as long as they don't know how to defend themselves against insults rather than other people defending them for them, they're going to remain hypersensitive, and each insult or each perceived slight is going to cause them considerable distress if and when it happens. And I thought that was a really interesting point and something that is a really pertinent issue in our society today.
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea being you can't stop other people from saying things that you don't like. So what you should focus on is not being so bothered by what other people say and get on with your own life. Exactly.
And I feel, this is a slightly different topic, but I feel like our culture in particular at the moment is erring on the side of, well, we've just got to stop people saying things.
Yeah. And that would be to try and focus on things that you cannot control. And that leads to all sorts of unforeseen consequences. And of course, is absolutely antithetical to people's freedom of speech and free expression anyway.
Absolutely. And I understand where that desire comes from. I understand what problem they're trying to solve. And I understand what they're trying to do by advocating that idea. But I agree with this book that a more helpful and more empowering approach would be to teach people how to defend themselves.
Absolutely. Well, our daughter's been very patient with us, but I think we're going to need to attend to her now. So maybe we should wrap it up with that.
Yeah, I think she wants to be walked around, which isn't very conducive to podcasting.
In summary, I would say this is a really good book, and I would definitely recommend reading it because I think there's a lot of great content in it. What do you think?
Absolutely. As I just said, I think there's a lot of stuff in here. First of all, it's very useful just on an intellectual level to learn more about Stoicism and how it applies to our daily life. But it's also, there's a lot of advice in there that is really sage advice about how to deal with common challenges that we all face, whether we're living in Roman times or living in the modern world.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.